And we're at the Warsaw Security Forum today, and my guest now is Dr. James Carafano, the Senior Counselor to the President of the Heritage Foundation. Hello, and thank you for joining us on TVP
Good to be
World.
with you, and it's always good to be in Warsaw.
Absolutely. Well, welcome to Warsaw. Now, it's my impression you've been traveling around Europe for the last couple months, so you're not getting over jet lag this morning.
Yep.
But the topic of conversation, let's start off with the situation in the United States,
Sure.
and of course these highly contested
Right.
elections. We don't know which way it's going to go, and I think a lot of people here in Europe are just on edge about
Right.
the possible turnout. So what has been your experience over the last couple of months talking with people around Europe about?
Well, I mean, to kind of explain the American elections, look, we are a 50-50 country. Unlike most European countries, we are really locked into a two-party system. So, if you don't like it, you just can't pick up your ball and go form another political party. It doesn't really work that way. So, what's happened is, in the last, say, 30 years or so, our political parties have become less ideologically and geographically diverse. So literally now the Republican Party is a conservative party. The Democratic Party is a progressive party. They have two very different directions that want to take the country in very different courses, which to me is the best for democracy. It's not a threat to democracy. It's a real choice. You have a choice of two very different visions for the future. That's, to me, the American voters are very lucky. But it's a 50-50 country. I mean, it's literally almost split down the middle. And the reality is both sides are kind of really digging in their feet. In the Republican Party, there's only two voters. There are people that love Donald Trump, and there are people that love everything about Donald Trump except they hate Donald Trump. But it doesn't matter. They're all going to vote for Donald Trump. And on the other side, on the progressives, they've been presented a new candidate. They've kind of 90 days to, a very short period to digest whether that is the right candidate. So I would say, look, it could go either way simply because the electorate is so, in a sense, bipolar. I will say that since getting the nomination, it's very clear that Harris has not gained momentum from there. That was, we're glad that we think we have a stronger candidate. But since then, it hasn't built a larger coalition, right?
Do you think this helped her, though, as a candidate with such short notice? Because normally the election cycle is like 2 years in the United States, right? And you go through so much media scrutiny that she was actually has somewhat of a bonus for only going through this little short period of...
Well, it's a big bet, right? Because they don't really have a chance to adjust fire. They have to pick an electoral strategy, what they've picked, and they can't really shift, right? So this idea about we're going to focus on the way forward, we're not going to revisit the last 4 years, and we're not going to get deeply engaged in debating the issues. We're going to talk about what's best for a vision for the country. Once you've made that choice, you can't go back because there's no time to really adjust. So there really wasn't much of a shift after the debate, if you look at the polls, and since then, if you're not growing, then all you're really doing is defending the vote that you have. And the question is that enough? Can that carry you through particularly in the key swing states that you have to win to get the electoral college? So Republicans, surprisingly, I think to a lot of people, have made inroads in some very traditional Democratic voting blocks, like black voters, Hispanic voters, labor voters. But the question is where do they vote, right? And so polls in the United States sometimes can be very accurate, and in the midterm elections they were actually quite accurate. In 2016 they showed Clinton up by a large margin and she lost. In 2020 they showed actually Biden up by a large margin and he won, but by an extremely narrow margin. So when you look at polls, it's what kind of polls do we have here? Do we have 2022-like polls or do we have 2016-like polls? So yeah, it's a hard choice. Here's what I will say, and this has been my message for Europeans. Somehow people think that this is an existential difference in Europe, and it's not. The United States is not leaving NATO. It does not matter who the candidate is. I know people in both, not in just the campaigns, but people involved in the governance on both sides. There is no plan to leave NATO by either political party ever. Nobody's going to abandon Ukraine. Now, they might have very different strategies for how to sustain Ukraine over time and how to terminate the conflict, but none of them involve handing Ukraine over to the Russians. Neither political party has any trust in Putin. Neither political party is really interested in giving him any major concessions. So America's not leaving Europe. There are going to be challenges, but I think the challenges are really about Europe deciding what's the vision for the future of Europe. So for example, in a Republican administration, energy policy is going to change dramatically. It's going to shift from how much reliable, affordable, abundant energy can be put in the marketplace. A lot of gas, a lot of oil, a lot of nuclear, renewables where it makes sense, but it's not going to be about driving to net zero goals, and it's not going to be about forcing green transition, and they're definitely going to eliminate the EV mandate. So where's Europe going to go? Is it going to continue down the path of green transition? Because that's, I think, going to make it much less competitive with the United States.
Well, and something that's come to light just recently is that Europe is actually sucking up LNG at such a pace from Russia still, continuing to take it from Russia, that actually Russia is supplying more LNG to the European Union than the United States. Is this something that should change and will change under a potential Trump administration?
Well, I mean, that is one thing that could dramatically change. Not only would the United States be very supportive of the United States, and when we talk about the United States, it's really about the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It's just one big energy superpower. Their goal would really be to maximize exports and really drive down the price of oil, in part because that'll probably impact the Russians more than just cutting off their LNG exports. Mm-hmm. But not only is the United States going to be, I think, in a much more aggressive position on energy exports, they're going to be much more supportive of energy projects in West Africa, in Southern Europe, and connectivity issues. You know, so for example, in the Three Seas Initiative, the Biden administration only committed $300 million, and it was only for green energy projects, which quite honestly are not, I think, going to deliver the sustainable, cost-efficient energy that need. I think this administration will be much more supportive of traditional energy projects. I don't think they're necessarily going to say we're not going to support any, but they're going to look very skeptically at mass subsidies for energy transition, particularly in the EV and the battery world, because I think if we're honest about this, there's no proof that there's payoff at the back end, that you're either going to drive dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases, or that you're actually going to deliver a better. We keep talking about growing green jobs and all that. We're not. We're just subsidizing jobs. But the question is, are those jobs sustainable? I think the answer is no. On trade, the United States is going to continue to be concerned about strategic dependencies on China and looking to limit them. When you hear a lot about tariffs, of course, we've actually seen more tariffs from the Biden administration than we saw from the Trump administration. But I don't think they actually will employ tariffs as just a carpet bombing the world. They want to use tariffs to drive out strategic dependencies. And the question is what do the Europeans want to bring to the table? So I think this is a really important message. What the future economic partnership between the United States and Europe looks like, honestly, regardless of whether it's a Trump or a Harris administration, is as much about what Europeans bring to the table as what Americans are demanding.
You mentioned under a potential Trump administration that likely the relationship between Europe wouldn't change too much. The United States isn't leaving Europe, but what do you think it would look like in terms of NATO expenditures, in terms of support for Ukraine, and maybe even, since we're here at the Warsaw Security Forum, for Poland in particular? Right.
So look, I mean, if you look at the two major concerns among American conservatives, there were two, right? One is, what's the plan? I mean, what are we doing? Are we just doing slow death for Ukraine here? Are we just throwing money at the problem? Or do we actually have a plan to not just ensure a free and independent Ukraine, but to ensure a defensible eastern frontier for Europe that allows Europe to remain free and safe and prosperous? And then the other one is, where's the European contribution? I mean, you have to pay your fair share. I actually think both of those are resolving themselves. I think it's very obvious that Europeans are on a path to step up their contributions. And I think the role for the United States in this is becoming clearer. So I'm actually pretty confident that under a Trump administration, things will actually go way better. And when you hear about this notion about Trump's going to be terrible, you have to ask, well, where is this coming from? He was president for 4 years. There was never a plan to leave NATO.
And he liked Poland very much.
He loved Poland, right? He was actually one of the first leaders to actually arm Ukraine. He was opposed to Nord Stream 2 and made a big deal about energy independence. So I think, so I think on a lot of the issues he actually proved right. And the reason why I'm actually confident is I think, by and large, Europeans understand that. There is a desire to get to energy security. There's a recognition that Europe needs to contribute more and partner with the United States. So I actually think it's going to work well. I would tell you, in my mind, the most critical relationship in the transatlantic community is the United States and Poland. And let me tell you why, because look, as somebody who was involved in the Cold War, the frontier of NATO today is actually in better shape than it was when I was on the front line. First of all, there's way more strategic depth. And if you actually look at the correlation of forces, it's more in NATO's favor today than it was back in 1989. And you have a much more robust northern flank with Sweden, Finland, and Norway. You've got a Ukrainian army, which is the largest army in Europe. And it doesn't matter if the Ukrainian army is in NATO or not. The Russians can invade NATO and just drive by the Ukrainians in waves, right? And then that is anchored in a really ambitious and I think very credible and very important, very relevant plan for Polish defense modernization, which I think is, to be quite honest, the key to the whole system. That makes just like actually getting West Germany to help defend West Germany and help US forces, Polish plans for future defense of Poland are the absolute freaking cornerstone of the future of NATO. And then that anchors, I think, in a very responsible plan in Romania. And so that defense plan, yeah, it's part of the transatlantic community, there's no question about that. It'd be great to have better relationships with Germany, there's no question about that. But the reality is that the real success and engine of that plan is going to be US-Polish cooperation.
Well, it seems like we're on a very good trajectory thus far. Dr. James Carafano, Senior Counselor to the President of Heritage Foundation, thank you very much for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And those are the latest thoughts from the Warsaw Security Forum. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and stay with us here on TVP World for more.